Chapter 13, Epilogue. Chuma remained at Dr. Livingstone's side for 7 more years of missionary exploration in Africa's interior. When the good doctor died from exhaustion and fever, Chuma and others carefully preserved his body and then carried it across half of Africa to the coast, where it could be sent by ship back to England for burial. Chuma was also invited to England to help tell the story of Livingstone's life to all those who had admired and supported his great work. Though Livingstone never had the privilege of seeing the fruit of his efforts, he opened the way for hundreds of missionaries to enter Central Africa and establish mission stations there. One of the most important was located on Lake Nyassa and named Livingstonia. Within 15 years of his death, through the influence of the gospel as well as other factors, the slave trade was brought to an end in Central Africa. More about David Livingstone. David Livingstone was born on March 19, 1813, on an island off the coast of Scotland. He grew up in a Christian home where his father was a tea merchant. After receiving a degree in medicine from Glasgow University in 1840, Livingstone became connected with the London Missionary Society. With the Society's support, he went to South Africa in 1841. He ventured north by lumbering ox wagon on a 10-week trip. But what he saw troubled him. The mission stations he visited seemed more interested in creating comfortable British outposts than pressing on to reach the unreached peoples of the interior. He also discovered that some of the missionaries were racist about the very people they were trying to reach with the gospel. They did not think the Africans were suited for much more than servants or field hands. Livingstone's complaints to the mission headquarters earned him the disapproval of some, and he was not granted permission for an extended missionary journey for several years. So he spent his time learning everything he could about Africa and its people. He became convinced that when English missionaries founded a mission station, they should set about training African converts to take it over as soon as possible. He quickly mastered several African languages and learned the customs of the people. On one shorter foray into the bush, Livingstone was attacked and severely mauled by a lion. It took months for him to recover, and the injuries to his shoulder bothered him the rest of his life. However, while he was recovering, he got to know Mary Moffat, the daughter of Dr. Robert Moffat, Bible translator and mission director. Shortly after they were married in 1844, the Livingstones set out to establish a new mission station on the frontier. From there, it was Livingstone's intention to make journeys deep into Africa to reach people who had never heard the gospel before. This he did in 3 dramatic expeditions. The first expedition extended north across the eastern edge of the Kalahari Desert to the river Zouga, and then west. He became the first white man to see Lake Ngami in 1849. He then went on to reach the Zambezi River in 1851. Before long, he came to realize that he wasn't an evangelist and had been called by God to explore and open up new areas for other missionaries to follow. Between 1853 and 56, he made a most remarkable trans-Africa journey, first out to the west coast, then back across Africa, down the Zambezi River to sight Victoria Falls, and then on to the east coast. It was on this first journey that he became aware of the devastation of the slave trade in Africa. When he returned to England in 1856, he was honored by the Royal Geographic Society as a major explorer and commissioned by the government to return to Africa as a British consul. He went back to Africa on his second expedition and started up the Zambezi River by riverboat. There he intended to establish Christian mission stations in the hope of spreading the gospel and stopping the slave trade. That situation provides the setting for this story. Though greatly simplified, this story follows the events of the Zambezi expedition with the following exceptions. Number 1, it's only conjecture, that means a guess, that Chuma and Wekatani were the spark the Redcaps used to ignite the tribal war. 2, while at least 2 freed slaves accompanied Livingstone in his attempt to contact the Ajawa chiefs on his Nyassa exploration, they are not named. 3, Livingstone's rescue from the Shire River is fiction, though he had an equally close call with death earlier when coming down the Zambezi River. 4, Chuma and Wikitani did not return to their homeland for another 5 years. For the sake of this story, the time frame was condensed. What actually happened in the meantime was that Livingston's second expedition came to a tragic end. Livingston's wife, as well as the wife of Bishop Mackenzie and some other women, came to join the men at the mission station. However, when Livingston was away exploring Lake Nyassa, the bishop made a canoe trip on which he foolishly carried most of the mission's medicines. The canoe capsized and all the medicines were lost. By the time Livingston got back, everyone was so sick with malaria that the bishop and all the women, including Mary Moffett Livingston, died. Shortly after that, even in the middle of his great grief, Livingston came across an official dispatch that conclusively proved that the Portuguese were involved in the slave trade. He sent off this proof to England, thinking the government would put international pressure on Portugal to stop the trade. However, it was more important to England to maintain good relations with Portugal at that time than to embarrass their ally by exposing Portugal's violation of the treaty. To avoid any further incidents, England ordered Livingston out of Africa. Heartbroken and discouraged, Livingston withdrew, vowing to return at his own expense as soon as he could. Rather than allow his riverboat, it was his third one by this time, to fall into the hands of the slave traders, he sailed it across the open sea to India. Chuma and Wikitani, as well as some other African and white sailors, volunteered to accompany him on this wild and dangerous voyage in which nearly all lost their lives. In India, Livingston enrolled Chuma and Wikitani in a mission school and sold his boat before returning home to England. Several years later, Dauma was reported to be a fine teacher in a mission school in South Africa. She had been among some of the women and children Livingston brought down the river to safety on his boat before he sailed to India. He arranged for them to be cared for at the mission station on the island of Zanzibar. 3 years after leaving Chuma and Wikitani in India, Livingston returned to take them back to Africa for his third expedition. They faithfully accompanied him until they arrived in their homeland. There Wikitani stayed, probably to get married, but Chuma continued on with Livingston. Livingston went deep into the interior of Africa and lost all contact with the outside world. Many thought him dead, until the New York Herald, that's a newspaper, sent newspaper reporter Henry Stanley on an expedition to find him or bring back conclusive news of his death. In March 1871, Stanley started his search from Zanzibar. In the fall, he finally located Livingston. The doctor was sick and out of supplies, but in good spirits. Their meeting is remembered by Stanley's famous words, "Dr. Livingston, I presume?" Though grateful for the visit and the fresh medicines and supplies, Livingston would not come out of Africa, so Stanley returned to worldwide fame for having found the great missionary explorer. When Livingston died on April 30th, 1873, Chuma and some other faithful companions carefully wrapped and embalmed his body and carried it to the coast. There, Chuma went back with the body to England, where Livingston was buried with great honor. Chuma met with the Queen and toured the country, telling others about the expeditions of Livingston. And that is the end.